They always say blood is thicker than water, but they don't tell you what happens when that blood starts to boil over, secrets and greed. In my family, it happened every October over a splintered oak box. A tradition that was supposed to bind us together ended up unearthing every skeleton in the closet. And by the time it was over, we weren't a family anymore. We were just survivors of a war we never even knew we were fighting. The last Saturday of October was always the best and worst day of the year. For most of my childhood, it was the best. It meant a pilgrimage to the old farmhouse, a sprawling 2-story relic that smelled like wood smoke, baked apples, and damp earth. The air outside would be so crisp it felt like biting into a cold piece of fruit. The trees would be a riot of burnt orange and blood red, and the drive up the long gravel road felt like entering a different world, a place where time had slowed to the rhythm of the seasons. The gathering was a whirlwind of noise and chaos. Dozens of cousins would tear through the fields, their laughter echoing off the barn walls. The women would cram into the kitchen, a symphony of clattering pans and overlapping conversations, turning out mountains of food. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green bean casserole, and at least 3 different kinds of pie. It felt like something out of a storybook, a perfect portrait of a loud, sprawling, deeply rooted family. At the center of it all was Uncle Earl. He was the patriarch, not just because he was the oldest, but because he willed it to be so. He was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the farm's foundation. His hands were thick and calloused, his face a roadmap of wrinkles from decades of squinting into the sun. He ran the farm with an iron will and a short temper, and he commanded a level of respect that bordered on fear. Then there was my cousin Jake. He was 10 years older than me, and from the moment he could walk, he was the golden boy. He had our grandfather's charming smile and Uncle Earl's ambition, a combination that made him practically royalty in our family. Everyone doted on him, praised his every minor accomplishment, and spoke of his future as if it were a foregone conclusion. My mom was the glue. She was Earl's younger sister, the eternal peacemaker who floated through the chaos with a plate of cookies and a gentle word, desperately trying to smooth over the cracks that were always threatening to show. And finally, there was Aunt Carol, my mom's sister-in-law. She was a woman who always seemed to be simmering. She'd sit in a corner, nursing a glass of iced tea, her eyes following Earl with a look that I didn't understand as a kid, but now recognize as pure, unadulterated resentment. The whole day, this beautiful, chaotic festival was just the prelude to the main event. After the sun went down and the kids were exhausted and the adults were mellowed by food and cheap wine, Earl would bring out the harvest box. It was a simple oak box, dark with age and held together with tarnished brass hinges. It wasn't beautiful or ornate. It looked like something you'd find in an attic, full of forgotten letters. But inside that box, as the story went, was the family's future. For 3 generations on this exact night, the head of the family, first my great-grandfather, then my grandfather, then Earl, would choose one male heir to receive everything. The deed to the 200 acres of prime farmland, the savings accounts, the antique farm equipment, the house itself. The decision was absolute, final, and unchallengeable. To the outside world, and even to some of the younger family members, it was just a quirky, old-fashioned tradition, a little piece of our history that we trotted out once a year like a holiday decoration. But even as a kid, I could feel what was really happening. It wasn't a celebration, it was a judgment. The air would thicken the moment that box appeared. Smiles, the easy laughter from dinner would evaporate, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. The men would straighten their postures, their eyes fixed on Earl. The women would watch their husbands, their hopes and fears reflected in their faces. It was a silent, brutal competition that had been running my entire life, a current of jealousy and ambition flowing just beneath the surface of every potluck and holiday. My dad, a quiet man who taught high school history and was more comfortable with books than tractors, never stood a chance, and he knew it. He'd just sip his coffee and watch, a sad resignation in his eyes. The contest was always, really, between the sons of Earl and his late brother, the husband of Aunt Carol. But in recent years, with Earl's own sons having moved away and shown no interest in farming, all eyes had fallen on one person, Jake. He was the heir apparent, the one everyone assumed would carry the family forward. The tradition was the stage, and Jake was the star. The year it all fell apart, I was 22, home from college for the weekend. The day felt different from the start. The usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by something heavier. Uncle Earl, now in his late 70s and looking more fragile than I'd ever seen him, had been quiet all day. He barely ate, just sat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the family as if he were taking inventory. When the time came, he didn't just place the harvest box on the dining room table, he slammed it down. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Everyone froze. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on my father, then on Jake, who was preening in his chair, practically glowing with anticipation. Earl cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "This will be the last time I oversee this," he announced, his voice gravelly but strong. The room held its breath. "I'm getting old. My time is done." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then a grim, humorless smile stretched across his lips. "It's time to see who's got the stomach to carry this family," he said, his voice dropping low, "and who's just dead weight." The air in the room went cold. The storybook charm of the farmhouse vanished, replaced by the stark, ugly reality of what this tradition had always been about. He wasn't talking about who could run a farm anymore. He was talking about who deserved to be part of the family at all. This year, it was about more than just a box. It was a culling. The moment Uncle Earl's words hung in the air, the family didn't just get tense, it fractured. It was like watching a pane of glass get hit with a hammer, invisible fault lines suddenly spiderwebbing out into sharp, dangerous pieces. The pretense of a happy reunion was gone, stripped away by Earl's declaration. People immediately started choosing sides, their allegiances shifting like sand. The room broke into hushed, urgent conversations. People who had been laughing together an hour ago were now standing in tight, suspicious circles, whispering and casting sideways glances. It was tribal, primal. You were either with Earl and his chosen successor, or you were against them. Jake, of course, was in his element. He immediately began holding court, walking around the living room like he'd already been crowned king. He wasn't just confident, he was radiating a smug certainty that was nauseating to watch. He'd clap a second cousin on the shoulder, making some vague promise about a loan for their small business once things are settled. Then he'd turn to another relative and make a thinly veiled threat about how important loyalty was, especially now. He was a politician working the floor, securing his votes, but his currency wasn't handshakes and smiles. It was a toxic blend of bribery and intimidation. He looked at my father with a condescending pity that made my own blood boil. It was the look of a predator who knows its prey is already defeated. Kingdom. Aunt Carol saw her opening. She pulled me aside, her grip on my arm surprisingly strong, her knuckles white. She steered me toward the pantry, the scent of spices and old wood thick in the air. Her eyes were burning with a fire I'd never seen up close before. "Don't you believe a word that comes out of that man's mouth," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. She was talking about Earl. "He's a snake, always has been." She launched into a bitter, rambling story about the year my grandfather died, how Earl and her husband, Robert, were supposed to inherit the farm together. But Earl, he cheated him, she spat, her face contorted with a decades-old rage. "He convinced your grandfather that Robert was too reckless, too much of a dreamer. He poisoned the well, Sarah. He stole my husband's birthright, and he invented this whole stupid harvest box nonsense to make it look noble, to make himself look like a king choosing his successor instead of the thief he really is." She was practically shaking, her entire body trembling with the injustice she'd been nursing for 30 years. He's going to do the same thing to your father. He'll find a way to humiliate him, to make Jake look like the only viable choice. You watch. My mom, bless her heart, was trying to hold back the flood with a teacup. She moved through the room, her smile strained, desperately trying to change the subject, to remind people about the pies still waiting in the kitchen, to get them to talk about anything other than the war that had just been declared. She approached my father and Earl, who were standing in a stiff, uncomfortable silence by the fireplace. "David, Earl, please," she begged, her voice quiet and pleading. "Can we just have a civil night for the family?" My dad looked at her, his expression weary. He'd been through this performance for decades. Earl just grunted. The dinner that followed was the most excruciating meal of my life. The clinking of silverware was deafening in the absence of conversation. Every bite felt like chewing on glass. My mom kept trying, asking about my classes, about a neighbor's new baby, anything to fill the void, but Earl would shut it down every time. He finally turned to my father, a cruel glint in his eye. "You know, David," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "I never understood what my sister saw in you. A history teacher." He said the words like they were an insult. "This land needs a man with dirt under his fingernails and ice in his veins. You're too soft. You always have been." He then gestured toward Jake with his fork. "At least that boy's got some fire in his belly. He knows you can't be sentimental when it comes to survival." My dad just stared down at his plate, his face pale, his jaw tight. He didn't say a word. He just absorbed the blow, the public emasculation, like he always did. After the plates were cleared, Earl stood up again, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "All right," he boomed, "time to sort the wheat from the chaff." This wasn't going to be a simple announcement. He was going to drag it out, to make a spectacle of it. He walked over to his old roll-top desk and pulled out 2 thick, leather-bound ledgers. He placed them on the table with a thud. "One of these is the real account of this farm," he explained. "The other, not so much." He opened the fake ledger. The pages were filled with figures in red ink, showing massive debt, foreclosures looming, the farm teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. "I want you," he said, looking at my dad and then at Jake, "to take a look at these numbers. And by morning, I want each of you to tell me what you would do, how you would save this family from ruin." It wasn't a test of business acumen. It was a test of character, a loyalty test, a morality test, and it was all based on a lie. My father picked up the fake ledger, his shoulders slumping as he flipped through the pages. The color drained from his face. He looked utterly heartbroken, believing that the family legacy he'd been excluded from was about to crumble into dust. But Jake was different. He scanned the pages, and I saw a sly, calculating glint in his eye that I had never seen before. It wasn't concern. It was opportunity. He looked like a wolf that had just been shown a wounded sheep. Later that night, as I was heading to bed, I passed the den and heard Jake's muffled voice through the closed door. He was on the phone. I pressed my ear against the wood, my heart pounding. "No, it's perfect," he was saying, his voice low and excited. "The old man thinks he's testing me, but he just handed me the whole damn thing on a silver platter. Don't worry, I've got a plan. By morning, he'll have to pick me." I leaned back from the door, a cold dread washing over me. What was he planning? What could possibly be perfect about the farm failing? It was clear then that Jake wasn't just playing Earl's game. He was playing a game of his own, and my father was the pawn he was about to sacrifice. The next morning, the farmhouse felt like a courtroom on sentencing day. The air was thick with anticipation and dread. No one spoke. We all just sat in the living room, nursing cups of coffee, waiting for the verdict. My father looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he stood up tall when Earl called his name, his hands clutching a few handwritten notes. He presented his plan with a quiet dignity that was almost painful to watch. It was a humble, honest plan. He spoke of scaling back, of selling off a small, unused parcel of land to cover the immediate debts. He talked about crop diversification, applying for government grants for sustainable farming, and everyone in the family pitching in, tightening our belts and working together to pull the farm back from the brink. It would be hard, he concluded, his voice steady. It would take years, but this farm was built on hard work and sacrifice. We can do it again. We can save it together. It was a speech about community, about resilience, about family. And in that room, it fell on deaf ears. Then it was Jake's turn. He didn't stand up with handwritten notes. He strode to the front of the room like a CEO addressing a boardroom. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt, and he had an expensive leather portfolio under his arm. He hadn't just been on the phone last night, he'd been preparing a presentation. He began by praising my father's sentimentality and good intentions, his words dripping with condescension. "But we're past the point of good intentions," Jake said, his voice ringing with false authority. "We're in a crisis, and crises require hard choices, not romantic notions about the good old days." He then delivered his masterstroke. He announced that the only logical, responsible way to save the family was to liquidate the primary asset. He wanted to sell the entire farm, not just a parcel, all of it. And he hadn't just thought about it, he'd already taken action. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his portfolio. "I was on the phone last night with a development firm," he announced proudly. "They're building a new luxury housing community in the county, and they are very interested in this land. They've already prepared a preliminary offer." He held up the paper. A number with a lot of zeros was visible at the bottom. Gasps rippled through the room. He then turned and looked directly at my father, his voice turning sharp and cruel. "Some of us are willing to make the tough, unsentimental choices to secure this family's financial future," he said, practically spitting the words. "And some of us would rather watch the whole thing burn down out of a misplaced sense of nostalgia." He had taken Earl's test and turned it into a weapon to publicly humiliate my dad, painting him as a weak, emotional fool who was incapable of leadership. Uncle Earl didn't even try to hide his glee. He smiled, a wide, proud grin like a hawk, watching its fledgling make its first kill. This was exactly what he wanted: ruthlessness, a killer instinct. He saw himself in Jake. He saw the future of his legacy, secured by a man who was willing to sell its past for a profit. But just as Earl opened his mouth to declare Jake the winner, my mom stood up. I had never in my entire life seen my mother snap. She was the family's shock absorber, the one who soaked up all the tension and anger and never let it show. But seeing my father, her kind, gentle husband, be so viciously dismantled in front of everyone was the one thing she could not absorb. Her whole body was trembling, her face was pale, but her eyes were on fire. "You want to talk about hard choices, Earl?" she said, her voice quiet at first, but shaking with a rage that had been buried for a lifetime. The room went dead silent. Everyone stared at her. "You want to talk about cheating and sentimentality?" Her voice grew louder, stronger with every word. "How about the choice you made to cheat your own brother out of this farm when your father died?" The accusation hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. Aunt Carol's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Earl's proud smile vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. "What are you talking about, Helen?" he snarled. "Don't be hysterical." "I'm not hysterical," my mom shouted, and the force of it made me jump. "I'm done being quiet. I was there, Earl. I was 17 years old, and I was in the room when Dad was on his deathbed. He told you both, you and Robert, that the farm was to be split equally. He made you promise to work it together." She took a step forward, pointing a trembling finger at him. "And 2 weeks after the funeral, you produced a will that no one had ever seen before, a will that named you the sole owner. You said Dad changed his mind at the last minute because he was worried about Robert's gambling debts." She let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Robert didn't have gambling debts. He had a dream of starting a small vineyard on his half, and you thought it was frivolous. You couldn't stand the thought of sharing control, so you forged that document. You forged it, and you stole your brother's half of this family." She was breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face now, but she wasn't finished. "This whole tradition," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, painful whisper as she gestured to the harvest box, "this whole disgusting, cruel performance you put us through every year, it was all a lie. You invented it to justify your own greed, to make your theft look like a dynasty." Have you ever seen someone hold in a secret for so long that when it finally comes out, it feels like an explosion? I want to hear about it in the comments. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the weight of a 40-year-old lie that had just been detonated in the middle of the room. Every family has secrets, but this wasn't a skeleton in the closet. This was the discovery that the entire house was built on a rotten foundation. Aunt Carol was staring at Earl, her face ashen. The bitter resentment she had carried for 30 years was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She had spent her life hating Earl for manipulating her father-in-law, for cheating her husband. But the truth was so much worse. He hadn't just cheated him, he had erased him. He had stolen his inheritance, his legacy, and then built a grand tradition on top of the crime to celebrate his own power. The family's entire history, the story we had all been told, had just been completely rewritten in the span of 30 seconds. And the new version was infinitely uglier. For a moment, I thought Uncle Earl might crumble, that the weight of his sister's accusation, delivered with such raw, undeniable truth, would finally break him. But I had underestimated the depth of his tyranny. Cornered and exposed, he didn't confess. He didn't apologize. Doubled down, his face twisted into a mask of pure reptilian rage. He took a step toward my mother, his fists clenched. "I did what I had to do," he snarled, his voice a low growl that vibrated with menace. "Robert would have run this place into the ground with his idiotic grapevines. I kept this farm strong. I kept this family fed." He wasn't defending himself. He was proclaiming his righteousness. In his mind, the theft wasn't a crime. It was a necessary act of preservation, and he was the hero for committing it. With everyone still reeling, he turned and grabbed the harvest box from the table. He marched over to Jake, who was standing there looking stunned and unsure for the first time all weekend. Earl shoved the box into his chest so hard that Jake stumbled back a step. "Here," Earl commanded, his eyes blazing. He declared Jake the new head of the family, not with pride, but with pure spite. He wasn't passing a torch, he was throwing a grenade. "He gets it. He's got my blood in him," Earl yelled, turning to glare at my father with an expression of absolute disgust. "He understands that you have to cut off the dead branches to save the tree, not like some of you." With that one sentence, he performed the final act of his reign. He had disowned my parents. He had severed the last ties, not with sadness, but with a final, brutal show of force. My mother, my father, and by extension me, we were the dead branches he was casting off. A triumphant, vicious smirk spread across Jake's face. He had won. The chaos, the secrets, the family implosion, none of it mattered. He had the prize. He set the box on the coffee table and fumbled with the old brass latch. He was so eager, his hands were shaking. He lifted the lid with a flourish, expecting to see the neatly folded deed to 200 acres of land. And it was there, right on top. But underneath it, something else. Another ledger. This one was much older than the ones from the night before. The leather was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed and brittle. Jake lifted it out, a confused look on his face. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a record of sins. In Earl's tight, angry script, it detailed everything. It started with a meticulous account of the original forgery, the lies he told the lawyer, the way he'd hidden the true will. But it didn't stop there. It went on, page after page, documenting decades of shady loans taken out against the farm, back alley deals with unsavory characters to cover crop failures, IOUs to neighbors he'd swindled, and illegal water rights diversions. It was a confession, a roadmap of every corrupt, immoral thing he had ever done to keep the farm afloat and consolidate his power. And the worst part? It implicated half the people in the room. There were notes about loans he'd given to cousins and never collected, using the debt to ensure their loyalty. There were details about a deal he'd made with Aunt Carol years ago, giving her a small monthly stipend from an anonymous account to keep her quiet and dependent, all while she thought she was living on her late husband's secret savings. The prize wasn't a gift, it was a trap. The family's future wasn't in the box. It was a meticulously documented conspiracy, a poison pill designed to ensure that whoever inherited the farm also inherited all of its enemies and all of its crimes. My father, and by extension, me, we were the dead branches he was casting off. A triumphant, vicious smirk spread across Jake's face. He had won. The chaos, the secrets, the family implosion, none of it mattered. He had the prize. He set the box on the coffee table and fumbled with the old brass latch. He was so eager, his hands were shaking. He lifted the lid with a flourish, expecting to see the neatly folded deed to 200 acres of land. And it was there, right on top. But underneath it, something else. Another ledger. This one was much older than the ones from the night before. The leather was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed and brittle. Jake lifted it out, a confused look on his face. He opened it to the first page. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a record of sins. In Earl's tight, angry script, it detailed everything. It started with a meticulous account of the original forgery, the lies he told the lawyer, the way he'd hidden the true will. But it didn't stop there. It went on, page after page, documenting decades of shady loans taken out against the farm, back alley deals with unsavory characters to cover crop failures, IOUs to neighbors he'd swindled, and illegal water rights diversions. It was a confession, a roadmap of every corrupt, immoral thing he had ever done to keep the farm afloat and consolidate his power. And the worst part? It implicated half the people in the room. There were notes about loans he'd given to cousins and never collected, using the debt to ensure their loyalty. There were details about a deal he'd made with Aunt Carol years ago, giving her a small monthly stipend from an anonymous account to keep her quiet, all while she thought she was living on her late husband's secret savings. The prize wasn't a gift, it was a trap. The family's future wasn't in the box. It was a meticulously documented conspiracy, a poison pill designed to ensure that whoever inherited the farm also inherited all of its enemies and all of its crimes. My father, and by extension, me, we were the dead branches he was casting off. Earl, not with the triumphant anger of someone whose side had been proven right, but with the incoherent fury of a woman who had been made a fool of twice over. The shouting escalated. Accusations started flying from all corners of the room as people recognized their own names in the ledger Jake was still holding. The family unit didn't just crack, it shattered into a million unrecognizable pieces right there on the living room floor. As my dad started the car, I took one last look through the big picture window. It was a tableau of ruin. Earl was standing alone in the middle of the room, people screaming at him from all sides, a king in a castle that was burning down around him. And Jake was just standing there, staring down at the poison ledger in his hands, all the color draining from his face as he finally understood the true nature of his inheritance. He hadn't won a farm. He had been handed a time bomb, and the fuse was already lit. The year that followed the Harvest Box disaster was a slow, agonizing funeral for a family that was already dead. The secrets in that old ledger weren't just moral failings, they were legal liabilities. Once the shouting died down, the lawsuits began. Neighbors Earl had cheated, distant relatives he'd extorted, business partners he'd double-crossed. They all came out of the woodwork, armed with the proof from Earl's own hand. The farm, which was already leveraged to the hilt with the shady loans Earl had taken out, became a legal battleground. It was tied up in so many disputes and liens that it was impossible to manage, let alone sell. The developer Jake had been so proud of took one look at the mess and retracted their offer immediately. The bank, seeing the chaos and the mountain of new debt claims, finally foreclosed. The land that had been in our family for over a century was sold at a public auction for pennies on the dollar to pay off a fraction of the creditors. The family legacy was gone, wiped out, not by a bad harvest, but by the rot that had been festering within it for generations. Jake, the golden boy, the chosen one, couldn't handle it. He was a predator, not a survivor. He was built for slick presentations and easy wins, not for navigating the consequences of a lifetime of corruption. The enemies Earl had made were now his enemies. People who had once clapped him on the back were now calling him at all hours, demanding money he didn't have. The pressure crushed him. He sold off what little he could, the antique equipment, the furniture, anything not seized by the bank, took what cash he could scrape together, and one day he just disappeared. His wife told the family he'd moved out west to start over. No one has heard a single word from him since. He just vanished, a ghost haunted by an inheritance he never truly understood until it was too late. The rest of the family scattered like ash in the wind. There was nothing left to hold us together. The farm had been the center, the gravitational pull, and without it, we all just spun off into our own lonely orbits. Aunt Carol became a bitter recluse. The truth didn't set her free. It imprisoned her in a new kind of misery. She cut off contact with everyone, unable to trust anyone after discovering the depth of Earl's manipulation. The last I heard, she was living in a small apartment, consumed by a rage that had no target anymore. Uncle Earl didn't last long after the farm was gone. His kingdom had crumbled, his power was gone, and his body soon followed his spirit. He passed away a few months after the auction, alone in a nursing home. My mom was the only one who went to the funeral. She said only 5 people showed up. A king with no subjects and no kingdom. My parents and I moved. We sold our house and bought a smaller one in the next town over. It was a fresh start, but it was also a retreat. We didn't have big family gatherings anymore. There was no family left to invite. Holidays became quiet, subdued affairs. Just the 3 of us. The silence in our new little house was often louder than the shouting in the old farmhouse ever was. We lost more than a farm and a box of secrets that day. We lost our cousins, our aunts, our shared history. We lost the feeling of belonging to something bigger than ourselves, even if that something was deeply, horribly flawed. Sometimes my mom will be cooking and she'll get a faraway look in her eyes, and I know she's thinking of that chaotic kitchen full of her sisters and cousins. She'll just shake her head sadly and say, "It didn't have to be this way." But it did, because the seeds of that destruction were planted long before any of us were born. They say you reap what you sow. For generations, my family sowed secrets and greed and a hunger for control, dressing it up in the costume of tradition. In the end, that's all we harvested, a crop of bitterness and ruin. That old, splintered box wasn't full of our future. It turned out to be a coffin for our past, and it buried every last one of us. Is any tradition worth losing your family over? Let me know what you think. I'll be reading every single comment.